Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Shout out to the people in our sound booth in the back, making sure that I know what to do to signal attention. How are you all feeling today? All right, one more time. We're a little off with that one. I know it's day 2. So how are you all feeling today? Excellent. I feel outstanding as well. I'm so glad to welcome you back to day 2 of our Positive Organizational Scholarship Conference. Just reflecting on my experiences from day 1, I saw lots of new and interesting presentations. You all are really pushing the boundaries around emotion research and what we mean by resilience and all the different ways that our identities can be positive, but also if we didn't have the negative, would we appreciate the positive? And I was super excited, of course, to see the POS session. That was one of the micro communities that I helped to co-found. And I'm excited for the future of DEI work from a POS lens and to expand that conversation this morning. And I just want to again thank Katina Sawyer and Judy Clare for their amazing groundbreaking work, just setting the tone yesterday that there are a lot of hardships going on in the world. And this is where our scholarship is even more relevant and important. So thank you all so much for sharing your presentation there. I want to quickly go over the itinerary for today. We have our main stage session, followed by our virtual presentations on the 6th floor. And then we'll have a refreshment break, followed by our 3rd research track session. Then we'll break for lunch, have our 2nd round of visual presentations, followed by our closing main stage session, which will be an experiential exercise. This morning, I want to do a couple of things. One, I want to honor that some of the founders of the POS community are here with us, Jane Dutton and Kim Cameron. So I'd like for all of us to please applaud them. I also saw Bob earlier. I know he had to run, but I was glad that I got to see Bob as well. And this session this morning, before we get started, I'd also like to make room for announcements. Any announcements that people have for this community. We have a microphone. Remember, you have 30 seconds. I know Natalie from Tulane has an announcement. She's over here.
Hello. So for the past, I think it's been a couple of years. What is time? Some junior scholars have been getting together monthly and virtually, of course, to just read some research that has come out recently about positive relationships at work / high quality connections. So if you are a junior scholar and you're interested in joining us to discuss those, we discuss like 3 or 4 at a time, please let me know and I'll put you on our email list.
Thank you so much. Amazing. This junior scholars are organizing. I love this. Brianna has an announcement here.
Hi, just building on the relationships theme. Jen Petriglieri and Lakshmi Ramarajan and I have an EGOS track for the next EGOS, which is next summer in a beautiful place. And we would love to have any of your submissions on relationships, especially from junior scholars. We will privilege empirical work, so please be ready to submit in December.
Do you know where the beautiful place is?
What?
Where's the beautiful place?
Oh, Sardinia, yeah. Sorry.
Awesome. Thank you. Any more announcements? All right. Oh, did you have one? Here. Oh, I'm sorry. Here, and then we'll go to Ryu.
Another relationships guy. I have a loud voice. So we have an ongoing blog called Work Ties, where we publish researcher-oriented versions of articles that are a little bit more digestible. So if you have something you'd like to submit, you can contact me. My name is Joel Gardner. I work with the wonderful Jessica Methot. Or if you would like to help keep this blog going, we're really just trying to translate work relationships-related research into more digestible content for practitioners. So,
thank you so much. Great.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I want to shout out for everybody to include you. If you are interested, if you're doing work on community, deep sense of belonging, if that's your jam, we have a mini community that is coming together on Zoom that also exists even when we come back to join and have conversations together. And we meet monthly. It's always content related. So this is a great opportunity to come and talk about projects you may be brewing, connect with people who do this kind of work, and if you may be excited to kind of build new project, get some feedback. We have amazing PhD students who do work in that space. Some of them defended recently, so shout out for them and their wonderful work. I do want to plug in kind of shout out for Huya, who's helping me kind of lead this crowd. So thank you for her. And if you're interested in community, please come check us out in the breakfast at Academy for POS. It's going to be exciting, and we hope we can create together some swift sense of community. Come check out how we do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing your announcements. All right, so now I'd like to welcome our session today, using POS to understand the state of the world. So when we decided to come back together after these last 2 years, we realized we could not ignore all of the different changes that we've experienced in society. In particular, we've experienced a prolonged period of collective loss, suffering, grief, and burnout as a result of violence, political divisions, discrimination, climate crises, and of course the global COVID-19 pandemic. It is in times like these where we find hope in our work, which is grounded in a commitment to reveal and nurture the highest levels of human potential through promoting resilience, compassion, thriving. And this is significant and important for us to address societal issues. Our work is extremely relevant. So during the session, we invited several scholars to share how and where we can use a POS lens as we encounter mega identity threats, transition to new ways of working, and deal with all of the mounting mental, emotional, and physical health changes. We will also, later in today's programming, we will honor scholars who we have lost and hold space for us to sit with our own and each other's grief. So I do hope that you're able to stick around for our session later today. I'm very excited to introduce our panelists for this conversation. And as I introduce you, I'd invite you to come join me on stage. So first we have Dr. Allison Gabriel. Allison is the McClellan Professor of Management Organizations and University Distinguished Scholar in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on emotions at work, employee recovery, interpersonal work stressors, relationships at work, motivation, employee well-being, all the things. So thank you, Allison. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Angelica Lee. Dr. Angelica Lee is an assistant professor of management organizations at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. Dr. Lee received her PhD in organizational behavior from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Keenan Flagler School of Business, the better school in the South. Dr. Lee's research takes a dynamic approach to studying diversity, and in doing so, she explores the often overlooked experiences and identities that may alter the effects of diversity in organizations. Thank you, Angelica. And last but not least, I am honored to welcome Dr. Sally Maitlis to the stage. Dr. Sally Maitlis is a professor of organizational behavior and leadership at the Syed Business School at the University of Oxford. Her research examines how people make sense of important, challenging, and sometimes painful issues at work, and highlights the emotional side of organizational life for individuals, work groups, and top management teams. She has a particular interest in processes of suffering, healing, and growth in the workplace, and is a founding member of the Compassion Lab. Another stream of research explores the joys and struggles of those pursuing the work that feels most meaningful to them, including the experience of losing the ability to do that work. So thank you to Dr. Maitlis. All right, so I prepared each of them beforehand, so none of this should be a surprise. But I wanted to ask each of them a set of questions that pertains to their research, and especially because all of their work has something to do with the state of the world that we're in today. So I asked if each of you will respond like 5 to now 10 minutes. We have more space in our schedule for them, so you have more time to elaborate your answer. So I want to start with you, Dr. Lee. So these past few years have surfaced mega threats that have a disparate effect on the health and well-being of specific populations. So what are some of the effective strategies that individuals and organizations can do to counter the effects of mega threats in the workplace?
Yeah, so I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So since I have 5 minutes, I feel like I might as well start off by kind of explaining what mega threats are, and then unpacking the effects of the events on individuals and organizations. And so we define mega threats, my co-author and I, as identity relevant large-scale societal events that receive significant media attention. So these are events in which oftentimes people are attacked, threatened, and unfortunately and tragically killed. And we all come to almost have this collective sense of this happened to these people because of their identity group membership. And unfortunately, though I am never in, I seem to always have current examples to pull from the world of these events, whether we're talking about the Buffalo Tops grocery store shooting, or we're talking about the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, and the subsequent racial justice protests that came from that. Or we're looking at shootings that have been happening in churches and synagogues. These are events that are identity relevant in that they really signal to other people who are members of those groups of the inherent dangers that come from your identity group membership, from simply existing in a world in which your identity is stigmatized and that you can be the victim of violence simply for how you look or who you worship. And so in thinking about the influence of these events, and when I first started this work, we started off trying to understand how do people bring these events with them into the workplace. I think in a world of COVID-19, we all know that the boundaries of organizations in some ways don't even exist really at all these days. But when you think about how do you bring these experiences with you at work, well, from an individual perspective, what we find is that when you're a member of the group that was targeted, threatened or harmed, when you're a Black employee who now has to go to work and be on a Zoom call after, watching a video of George Floyd being murdered, in the streets, that is something that sticks with you. You're worried about whether that similar thing can happen to you, your family, and your friends, and it's an experience that doesn't go away very easily. And so when you're at work and you're dealing with this experience, you also have the moment in which a lot of times, a work colleague comes up to you and they're just like, how are you doing today? And there's so much that goes through your mind in that time. How am I doing? The world, my world has fundamentally shifted, but I guess I'm doing fine. Like, how are you? And so what we find is that when you're in this situation where you can't really express this threat, when you feel that you can't really be open and honest about how you're doing that day, that it has these predictable negative downstream consequences on withdrawal in terms of your tasks, but also socially engaging with your colleagues, or the opposite of that, disengaging from your colleagues. And so now to get to the question that I was asked, what can individuals and organizations do? I think, in doing this work and in our recent paper, one of the things that was the most fascinating to me in trying to understand what is the moderator to turn off this negative effect. It really was a journey in order to figure out what that moderator was. And over the course of my dissertation work, we looked at a lot of the things that a lot of our organizational scholars are familiar with, of things like organizational demography. If there are more racial minorities in the organization, would that help? Climate for inclusion, if you feel included in decision making and you feel like you belong in the organization, would that help? LMX, if you feel like you have a really good relationship with your supervisor. And I think one of my favorite parts of the paper, well, this didn't go in the paper, obviously, because that's not how we publish research, right? But one of my favorite parts about the journey of getting to the paper was the fact that none of those moderators worked, right? And so what we found, and this was really simply from asking employees, have you felt comfortable talking about this with your work colleagues? Why or why not? And there was this very strong sentiment that it was taboo to talk about this thing at work, that people didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And whether this was our racial minority respondents, so we had data from Asian employees in the wake of the Atlanta area spa shootings, or Black employees in the wake of two highly publicized shootings in Texas, and in the wake of George Floyd. And the responses were largely from both sides of, I didn't really want to make people feel uncomfortable, from both white white employees and racial minority employees. And then from a racial minority employee perspective, people said things like, I can't afford to bring up these things and alienate myself from my colleagues. It's not worth risking my job to bring up this touchy subject. And so what we found is that there really was this micro level feeling of, did you feel comfortable bringing this up with your coworkers? Did you have the identity safety? This is a construct that you've talked about in your work, to really talk to your colleagues about that, that turn that off. And so when we're thinking about conversations of identity and race, it's really interesting to me that something as simple as saying that you're not doing okay because you saw someone die in a video seems on the surface like it wouldn't be a controversial thing to say. And yet we live in a world where when you bring that up, it brings race into the conversation, it brings your identity to the fore, and it reminds people that we are different, and because we tend to ignore our differences, it becomes this interesting moment where people are like, I'd rather not confront that. So I think, in terms of what can individuals do, in terms of when you think about research on relationship building and actually feeling psychologically safe around your identity in particular, is really what we found is the thing that allows employees to be able to push through the negative effects of megathreats. And so from an organizational level, to me, what that means is that organizations need to not just be focused on whether their employees feel as if they're included in, decision-making processes and whether they can, truly belong in terms of their teams, but also are employees able to truly bring their whole selves to work? Are all of your employees actually able to bring their full selves to work, or are only a portion of your employees able to do that? Okay.
Thank you so much. No, thank you.
Was that
and
5
and Dr.
minutes?
Lee is
I
being
don't know.
modest. You can read about her theoretical model in the Academy of Management Review and read about her empirical work in the Academy of Management Journal. So make sure you follow up with that work there. And what I love about your scholarship too is it's identity enhancing behaviors, right? The fact that someone can unlock that sense of safety for you, whether it's not just asking how you're doing, but not trying to ignore your race, right? Being able to see that, name it on the surface, and call attention to the fact that these things are happening because of the groups that you belong to. All of that can facilitate the sense of safety and well-being. And Allie, not to put you on the spot, but are we able to do that in a virtual world? Can we see people's emotions at work in this new way of working that's more remote? How are people managing these virtual interactions at work? And what does that mean for things like relationship building and trust building that Angelica pointed out is so crucial for a lot of people's well-being?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, it's a question I tried to avoid. And I say that because, when the pandemic started, we had our daughter the day before the pandemic began, or it was called. It completely shaped my motherhood experience. And I say this because I made this very sweeping declaration as I was coming out of maternity leave of under no condition will I study anything to do with this pandemic. So I want to talk to you about our paper on Zoom fatigue. To give you a bit of a backstory, because I think that how we talk about Zoom and virtual meetings and the fatigue we're feeling, it's real, and I think it affects the quality of the relationships that we have and the ways that we approach it. And I want to talk about 3 people and I tell this backstory particularly for the junior scholars and the doctoral students here to give you insights of how did this research even become. So it involves Kristen Shockley, Darren Robertson, and like most good stories, Adam Grant. And Kristen approached me in late 2020 and said, I've had this opportunity. I think the Zoom fatigue is real. I think it's affecting people. I think it's affecting relationships. And this company, Broadpath, led by Darren Robertson, has approached me. It's ironically in Tucson, which is where UA is. And they approached me, and they're open to doing a real field experiment of coming in and manipulating camera use for their remote workers. So they're going to let us come in for a month. And the data collection was already happened. And she's like, I was able to come in. And for 2 weeks, half the employees were asked to keep their cameras off. The other half kept them on, and then they flipped at the midpoint. And she's like, I was able to get daily assessments of their fatigue and their voice and their engagement in the meeting, so how much people felt like they could speak up. And so I came in at the data collection is over, and let's analyze and let's dig in. And the effect of being on camera was just this whopping effect on fatigue for people. And I tried to break this data every way possible. I'm like, well, it can't just be the camera. Like, that can't be it. It's got to be the number of meetings. It's got to be the amount of time people are spending. And we had their Outlook calendars. So the company was super generous. We had their information, and we plugged these controls in, and they had no effect on fatigue. It was the camera. And it's interesting because it's the camera that I think gives the illusion of relationships, that, oh, I can see you, so we're still connected. And then the ironic twist here is that that was contributing to fatigue, and that was actually making people feel less engaged and less, voicing out less in the meeting. So the very thing that the cameras were supposed to do was actually diminishing it. And to complicate matters further, we found that women and organizational newcomers were more fatigued from being on camera. And so it was like this self-presentation effect over and over and over of, oh, I'm on camera, I see this, this light shining on me, kind of like right now on the screen. And I see this light shining on me, it's making me self-conscious, it's making me feel really drained and fatigued, I'm having to manage it. I see people nodding, but are they nodding at me? Oh, they made a face. Is that at me, or did somebody chat something about me, right? And so there's all these complicated interpersonal dynamics that I think at the beginning of the pandemic we ignored, right? Because we made the flip really quickly. So I was told, because I was on parental leave and blissfully unaware that all this was happening. But we made this flip really, really quickly. And I think at the beginning it was good to be on camera and to see people, because we're like, oh, we're distanced, right? So we need to feel like we can see each other and connect. And now over time we're like, no, like we didn't pause to think, like, is this actually good for relationships? Is this actually good for my well-being? So we published this work and tweeted about it, and we kind of thought that was it. And then I got a text message from Kristen, who's at UGA. It was like really early on the West Coast, and she sends me a screenshot, and it's a tweet from Adam of our paper with the two figures that myself and Nithya Chava, who's a co-author, I see her in the back, that we made of our paper and our findings. And Kristen was like, well, this could be interesting. And it was for 2 weeks. We still and even this morning, I'm still getting pinged from people of like, hey, like this is my life. Like what you're talking about is real. And this fatigue I'm feeling of being in this virtual world is terrible, and how do we talk about this, and how do we fix this? And so this is kind of the lens that I've been thinking about, kind of virtual relationships and fatigue and all these emotions that we've been experiencing over the last couple of years, and how do we fix it? So I took notes because I get anxious when I don't have slides in front of me, I realize. So I regret when I was like, I don't need slides, I'm a hero. And I was trying to think, like, how do we fix this? And so I tried to, I'm like a motivation researcher at my core, like the first theories I learned as a doctoral student at University of Akron, just up the road, down the road over that way, were control theory and self-determination theory. My heart always goes back to self-determination theory. And I think what virtual work has done in a lot of ways is it has deprived or kind of taken away our three core needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence, right? It's made us feel forced in how we approach our relationships, because we feel like, oh, we have to go in these meetings and we have to look like this and we have to have a perfect room and a perfect background, and this doesn't feel authentically myself anymore. Or I feel like I don't know how to connect to people in a virtual world, right? I feel like I don't know how to talk to a Zoom screen of 30 people in a way that makes me feel good and connected. And so when I describe what we can do, a lot of this is actually coming from, and I mentioned Adam tweeting us, it's coming from the people who have reached out to us in return. It's been a really interesting experience having people directly email myself and Kristen and others saying like, yeah, this is real, and here's what I wish you would tell people to do about it. So I'm going to tell you what they've told me that I wish we could do about it. And I think it comes back to self-determination theory, because a lot of it is restoring autonomy and connection to people. One is that I think as organizational scholars, we should be encouraging managers to thinking of work on positive emotional cultures and the like. I think we should talk about communication cultures, right, for virtual worlds of what do we want this to look like for people. So do we want to have discussions, and I think we should be, as managers, as even in our own teams that we're working with, of what do we want this to look like? Like when people have their cameras off, let's stop calling attention to that, because that could be happening, as Angelica said, for a very authentic, important reason, right? That they are sitting with grief, that they are sitting with their own demands, that they are a mother that has a baby on the floor next to them, which was my reality for a lot of this. And they don't really want that on screen because they're not ready to share that part. Or vice versa, if somebody is sharing that part of themselves, let's not view that as a lack of professionalism, right? Let's realize that that's actually just a very authentic reflection of who they are in that moment. So I think having those conversations and creating cultures around that. I think the other big piece of this is we're at this interesting inflection point where there's this like rush to return to work, right? And to return to normal. I think that is just not going to happen for a lot of people, right? There's a lot of people who aren't ready. I don't know if I'm excited to be here, but if you had asked me a few days ago, like, are you ready to be here? I think I would have told you very authentic, I don't know. And so I think we need to also be having conversations as we are going into hybrid work and remote work or whatever this is going to be, of actually talking with employees. We have a unique opportunity to allow employees to craft their workplaces and their workspaces in ways that work with them as opposed to against them. I'm thinking of caregivers in particular here who have a unique opportunity to craft work that allows them to more authentically talk about who they are at home and in the workplace if they want to. And so I think thinking of how we structure that is going to be really important, because my worry is that in this era of remote to hybrid to in-person work, we're just going to start to see, oh, let's have a virtual meeting now, and now we're in person, and now let's do a hybrid, and now let's just fill your days with all these different modalities of meetings, which I don't know if you're like me, but like I could use a lot fewer meetings. The last piece here is I really want us to rethink what we mean by social connection in remote worlds. So I really think for a long time we have viewed Zoom as like the only means to create connection. I think that's a mistake. I remember, Katina, I don't know if you remember the story. Yeah, Katina's there. We love Katina. She's coming to UA. We're very excited. And I remember it was one of your conversations we were having as you were kind of making your decision, and we were going to chat, and I called you on the phone, and you were like, oh, a phone call. Like, this is new. Like, right? Like, we're not on Zoom. Like, this is nice. Like, we can both like walk and just talk and like connect and not be so stressed about, being on camera and is my Wi-Fi working? And this is kind of rambling now, but I just think we fell into these really quick assumptions of what this has to look like in this remote world, and we never challenged them. Like, we never took a step back and said, do we actually need to keep doing this, or can we go back to like just picking up a phone or sending an email? Because I think going back to some of the core of like, why are we doing the things we're doing would help us build better relationships. So I don't know if I ever answered your question.
No, yeah, you totally
but
did. I love these examples too, and I think what both you and Angelica are bringing to light is, in this collective new way of working and being and existing, so many things have come to the surface. This reality that we cannot leave ourselves at the door, that the grief comes with us, the fear of vicarious trauma comes with us, and then the way that we're structuring work is either going to help boost our positive experiences with the reality of the world, or it's going to exacerbate some of the negative ones. And I think I'm so excited for Sally's forthcoming work that is not only helping us understand how the state of the world has exacerbated mental health issues, but it's shifted how we talk about it in the workplace. I think that was another thing that was always considered taboo, to either acknowledge that we are experiencing some mental distress, especially for people who are in positions of power. So in your new work, Sally, how have you seen and observed a shift in the way that leaders experience and think about their own and others' mental health in the workplace?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here, and it's great to be part of this conversation. I think all our work is so different and also connects, so as you've been talking, I've been really hearing that. And what I'll do first maybe is talk about how leaders think about, how they've come to think about mental health in organizations through the pandemic and since, and then talk a bit about their own experiences of mental health. And yes, as we've been saying, and everybody knows, the pandemic caused an awful lot of distress, amongst many people. And the data on depression and anxiety, certainly in Britain, it doubled during the pandemic. I think in the US, it went up fourfold. And what we know now is it has sort of come down, but not to pre-pandemic levels, which were high anyway. And so one of the things that I'm really struck by with the pandemic is, this distress was so widespread that it really made what's already been there. I mean, it made things worse, but it also opened our eyes to what has always been there, which is people have always had difficult experiences, and that has impacted their work, and they've had difficult work experiences, and that has impacted their mental health. And so, I hate to say one of the good things about the pandemic, but I really do think one of the good things is that it has normalized and made visible mental health issues that were always there, and we just were looking the other way. And so in terms of of leaders and what that means for leaders. I mean, first of all, I think there's so much greater awareness of mental health struggles in organizations. And even, long before COVID, the data on something like depression and anxiety at work was kind of 1 in 6 people at any time were dealing with a condition like that. And so you just, look at this room. Mm-hmm. So 1 in 6 of us, at least 1 in 6 of us, probably much more at the moment, is experiencing. That wasn't a joke. Experiencing something like that. And so as people have become more aware of this and as leaders have become more aware of this, there's also been these sort of shifting norms about what can we hope for and even expect from our organizations. And we have workforce, particularly the younger workforce, who feel, well, my organization and my manager and my leaders kind of owe it to me to support me if I am struggling and to create work environments where I don't feel this way. And again, I don't want to be super idealistic. That's not my style, but I do think this is positive. I think this is important, that this should be a responsibility of organizations. And then that means that managers and leaders need to become more comfortable with this stuff. Mm-hmm. And they don't need to become, therapists and counselors, but they do need to not be afraid of this idea of somebody who's having a mental health difficulty. And they need to be able to create a bit of space for that person to tell them, talk a bit about it, ask for help, and to be able to refer them and direct them to somebody who can give them professional help or give them some time off. And as managers and leaders have begun to see this more as part of their role, certainly we've seen in Britain, I've seen data, more global data about the increase in interest in this in executive education, that people are wanting to do courses and wanting to get training in just understanding better and mental health and how to help people with it. And I run a senior leadership program in Oxford, and we now have a session which is about mental health, and I present some of my research from leaders I've studied and talk about how to look after your own mental health and how to be aware of other people's mental health. And it's not trying to give people a false sense that they can make everything better, but it's just trying to make people less scared of this, because I think we still have this, it's another taboo. Like mental health problems are sort of dangerous somehow. What will happen? And this person will erupt or they'll collapse, and then what do I do about it? And you don't have to do much. You just have to give them the space to feel they can bring that. So very much what Angelica, you were saying. But another piece that I think has come in, and we were just talking about this over lunch yesterday, is there's all this excitement about opportunities for self-care and individuals to get the mindfulness apps, get the resilience apps, do the online therapy, do everything themselves. And I was very glad to be part of a team. I don't know if Michelle Barton is in here at the moment. She led a brilliant experience of writing a piece for Harvard Business Review about relational pauses, and this idea that if we want people to build resilience and to build well-being, it is inherently relational. I mean, we know that mental health is grounded in relationships. And so it's no good saying to people, well, you go away and sort of fix your mental health and come back and then you can work here. It's about creating opportunities for people to work with each other to share their own experiences of what's good at work, what's difficult at work, and just feel less alone with it, because isolation is such a massive part of a mental health challenge. So to sort of come to leaders' experiences, I think one of the problems with now we have these hopes and these expectations of leaders to support their employees is I think it has made it harder for them to feel they can surface their suffering and their struggles. And I have even had people in my research just say, well, look, they're paying me, they're paying me this salary, so I should be sucking it up and getting on with it. And I just think that's rubbish. That doesn't mean you're not human anymore just because you're very well paid in your job. So before the pandemic, back in 2018, 2019, I began a study of senior leaders' experiences of depression and anxiety. And I was initially just interested in what's it like to be having an experience like that, to be living with that mental health condition while you're in a leadership role. How do you experience that? How do you cope with it? And what that revealed, and it revealed many things, but one of the things it revealed was how very stigmatized mental health conditions are in senior leaders, and how our sort of romantic ideals of leaders and of leadership sort of perpetuate this silence around the suffering of senior people in organizations. And also revealed that they were suffering. And I didn't do a survey and I didn't do a prevalence study, but we know that from other data anyway, that senior people, I think one study found that 60-odd% of senior executives had experienced difficulties with their mental health, but that 58% of those had not felt able to speak about it because they felt it would impair their reputation. You can't be known to be having a kind of struggle. And so during the pandemic, this also went up. It went up from sort of 64 to 78%, and there was this data about senior executives, self-medicating through drink and drugs and, all the usual things. And this is all more common in men. And we know from all the mental health research that it's men who find it hardest to talk about this stuff. And of course, a lot of our leaders are still men. So it sort of feels like a very compounding problem. And so what I was seeing was people, dealing with these mental health problems, and then feeling a very strong need to hide it from absolutely everybody, that nobody at work should know about, and often their spouses didn't know about it either. So they were deeply alone with it and ashamed of it and cutting off from it, to the extent that many of them didn't even sort of think of themselves as having a mental health condition. They felt this way. They'd felt this way for a long time. They didn't think of it as a mental health problem that they could speak about and get some help with. And so in my study, often it only even sort of surfaced when they reached a point of breakdown. And then they went and got help, and then they kind of began to make sense of what had been happening for them. But this doesn't sound very POS, does it? So let me lift us all up again. And say that one of the things I was interested in is I went back to some of the leaders that I had been studying before the pandemic when we all went into lockdown. And I said, well, so how is this affecting you? And I was really delighted but surprised to hear that for a lot of these people, they felt that having been through what they'd been through, having had their depression or anxiety, having realized they had it, having got some help for it, having become more open about it, it actually equipped them incredibly well to deal with the new strains and stresses of life in COVID. And they felt that they not only were able to sort of read themselves better, so they understood their own states better, but they were also much more able to attune to other people's suffering. And they felt they could tell and they could see in other people because they had come to recognize it in themselves. And so I think what feels very hopeful from this is that, coming through, dealing with in an ongoing way, or coming through a mental health struggle is actually really strengthening. It's actually something that people have learned a lot from about themselves and about other people. And it is a really different perspective from our idea that these people are vulnerable, and if they were exposed to crisis, they might crumble. And no, the contrary. They've been there, they've gone through it, they've learned a lot, and now they're coming forward stronger. So I think, what I would say about mental health and leaders' own mental health and their appreciation of it in organizations is they do have a much better appreciation. We all do. But we should take care that just in recognizing the need for other people to have support, those leaders themselves also need a space to be able to talk and deal with their own struggle.
Thank you so much, Sally. And I think as I was sitting here reflecting on what you were sharing, I think about the stigma of mental health. So I'm glad that you brought that up. We don't have a lot of the language to even know how to talk about it. I think we do operate, you mentioned, like, not as if we're not human. Right? That if I'm paid a certain amount, if I am at a leadership level, then I should just check my humanity at the door, to the detriment of all these other parts of myself and the exacerbation of that mental health will have on our communities. If our leaders are self-medicating in harmful ways, that's going to create a ripple effect to the policies they create, to how it is that they're managing and leading, and it will affect the greater world. And I think, too, listening to each of your presentations, I thought of two things. One, they're doing very relevant research, and it definitely just shows the importance of POS scholarship and why it is important that we continue to do this work into the future, because it's going to be so needed as we try to redesign our way of working. And I kept thinking about Ted Lasso. I don't know if any of you have seen Ted Lasso. It is a phenomenal show. It is a phenomenal show. And I'm saying this in jest, but also in truth. I highly recommend watching Ted Lasso. They talk about racism. They talk about different ways of working together when there's mental health crisis. I'm still thinking about the virtual work engagement, Allie, but Ted Lasso was fascinating. Well, the way that he tried to connect with his son virtually and how that can sometimes break down. I don't want to spoil, but highly recommend everyone look at Ted Lasso too. And again, just thinking about how relevant our work is, right? How relevant our work is even for something as popular culture as something like Ted Lasso. You all did such a great job with the timing too that we have time for questions. So great job to you all. So Serenity and Christina have microphones here. I'd love to hear your questions. I do want to be mindful that there's a lot of you in this room and we'd love to hear the question, right? Not your backstory, ideally. So if anyone have a question. All right, right here, Judy. Just the question.
This question's for Allison, and forgive me if this actually was you who wrote this, but I read somewhere that there was a study looking at Zoom and stress experiences, and it was looking at, or it found that one of the reasons why people found it so stressful was that they constantly saw their image, and it created this kind of cycle of self-judgment and awareness of how one looks that isn't normally there as much, at least. And I'm curious whether, I don't know, maybe that was you guys, but I don't know, did you find any evidence of that from how people especially were replying to you?
Yeah, so so we didn't test that exact effect in our study, but that's kind of the underlying theory of the self-presentation we feel in these virtual meetings kind of gets amplified from the awareness of being on camera, but because you can see yourself, right? And I know, like, I find that super distracting because I'll be watching myself on the screen. I'm like, is that what I look like? Like, and you're like, God, that is. Like, that's what we're working with today.
Like my braids. What are my braids doing?
It's really distracting. But yeah, so that's kind of some of the underlying interesting theory of just like self-presentation costs and what that is doing to us. And so when we were hearing from people, there's some like easy fixes. Like, so you can turn the self view off on virtual meetings, which I didn't know about for a long time, but that's a feature you can turn off. But that doesn't take away some of the other self-presentation issues of, again, I think the nonverbals, because that's a thing, like we'll get some pushback of like, well, like meetings have always existed. So like why do we care? But I think the nonverbals get really, really murky when you're in a virtual setting. Because again, in a meeting room like this, if I see somebody nodding right now, I'm like, well, we're making some eye contact. Like we're making some eye contact, you're nodding, and I think it's at me, so that's good. But in a virtual setting, if somebody's nodding or like making a jeer or doing something, you're like, is that at me or is that like something else going on? But yeah, so some of it is like your own perception of yourself, and then it also then gets amplified by the perception of how you're trying to process what other people are doing in the room with you. So it was kind of us, but we didn't test it. But I think it's related.
Thank you. Another question. I'm trying to make sure we don't miss. Up there. Thanks, Serenity.
Hi, hello. I guess it's a question for both Allison and Angelica. Both what you guys are talking about remind me of kind of how we're transpath or like transcending the work-family boundary. So, you know, the meta thread talks about how your personal identity impact your work identity. And then as in one thing with the Zoom fatigue that shook me was you saw where people live. And a bunch of celebrities have like fake bookshelves during the pandemic to make sure that they look smart. Anyway, I'm just curious. So I think traditionally work family research focuses a lot mainly on like the high level like conflict and enrichment. Where do you see this field of research going in terms of what you guys specifically talked about? And then if everything is work family in the new work era, how do we approach this topic? So, thank you.
Oh, I guess I'll get started. So I think, you know, when you think about the idea of, you know, all of a sudden you're on Zoom, and particularly like being overnight on Zoom, and where am I going to put my Zoom camera, and what am I going to have behind me, and what do I show, right? And it's interesting because I feel like there was this sentiment that was like, we're all in this together. And there was all this, we're all in this together talk. And yet when when you think about like transitioning to Zoom and now having to find a dedicated space in your home to be, on Zoom, and what are you going to show in the background? Like, you clearly realize the differences that we all have, right? And your life now is on display, but what parts of your life do you want on display, right? So if you go back to this idea of being on camera, reducing the amount of autonomy you have, the amount of determination you have to be able to decide how much of yourself you want to integrate, it becomes even more of a challenge when you realize like, oh, I have this, poster behind me, and I actually did this on purpose, that is about the great migration of Black Americans from the South to the North in the time period that happened. And I'm blanking, I don't remember, but you guys had history, so you get it, right? And so I'm like, okay, I was like, yes, this is what I want to make sure that I'm displaying this part of like a flag of myself. But think about all the time I just spent in explaining that to you, never mind the amount of time it took me to decide, do I want to have this behind me when I'm teaching executive MBAs, and what is this going to say, about me to them? And I was like, this is exactly what I want to say to them. But you can see how just like even that decision is different depending on your identities, your work family, whether you have children at home. But when we talk about these issues, we tend to talk about them as if we're all processing them and experiencing them in the same ways. And to me, it's much more liberating to just say like, no, I actually I had these other considerations, just like you have other considerations to think about when you're making these decisions. So I think, to answer the question of where would the research go, I think, to me, we have this opportunity to really, push the research forward by, considering these different factors, and whether it's your identities or your children or mental health, and what are the similarities behind the decisions to disclose these aspects of yourselves, and what are the differences, right? What are the challenges? What are the circumstances that allows people to feel most comfortable to integrate more? And I think that might have been rambly, so I'm going to stop.
Yeah, well, no, it totally fits what I was thinking. Am I on? I think I'm on, yeah. It totally fits what I was thinking, and I think this idea that in virtual worlds we're disclosing parts of identities. I think it's so important to kind of go back to how do we talk about like the cultures that we want to create in this virtual world, and can we do it in ways that are unapologetic. And so I'm thinking of myself, but other meetings I've had where like kids have been in the room and people are apologizing, right? Like, I'm so sorry, like my kid's in the room, or I have my baby with me, or I have to feed my baby. And wouldn't it be nice to exist in a world where we don't have to apologize for that anymore? And so I'm hopeful, maybe too optimistic, I don't know, but I'm hopeful that this has awoken the idea that like we don't want to go back. Like I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to a spot where I can't talk about these things, or I don't want to go back to a spot where people feel like they should be apologizing. Like I've seen some articles that make me cringe of like, we need to set the new norms of professionalism for virtual work, and like no more like kids, no more showing up in athleisure, which to that I say, no way. We're not going back. But I think like, can we do this in ways that are really unapologetic? And if I can make like just a very broad statement, like a lot of the topics we've been talking about today are very phenomenon focused. And I think there's this hesitation we have to approach work from a phenomenon orientation, right? Like I've gotten dinged for that when we started doing our work on like menstruation and breastfeeding. Like I was told like, that's not a management topic. Like that is too phenomenal. Like what's the theory? Like I remember somebody staring at me being like, well, what's the theory of breastfeeding? And I was like, like, let's talk. But like, I wish we would, like, I feel like if there was ever a community to be oriented, right? Like, what? So weird. It's ridiculous. Like, if there was ever a community to be oriented towards tackling issues that are phenomenon focused in a really impactful way, I truly believe it's this one. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation today. This is like a general plea, rallying cry of like, do phenomenon focused work. Like we don't need, in my view, like of course we want to inform theory with what we're doing, right? Like I don't want to be like throw theory out the window. But I feel like we can take a phenomenon focus that can inform some theory we already know, but then we don't need the big, bad, beautiful theory that connects every box and arrow in your model if you're telling the story of something that people are actually going through. And I think that's at the core of your question of can we tackle questions that are actually reflecting what people are going through as we're transitioning into whatever this new normal is going to be.
Absolutely. I have a follow-up question for Sally directly related to this point. And people want to cheer your I agree, right? The time for a shift in research. My follow-up question for Sally, too. You mentioned like how we want to communicate these things about ourselves. Have you seen specific ways that leaders who are, I don't want to say doing better with their mental health, but how are they communicating about their mental health if it's starting to open up the aperture of we can now have this conversation? Like what are some of their communication strategies and how should we be communicating about it even in our own research? Because I think our research might reinforce the stigma of mental health in the way that we talk about it and the way that we frame it in our theories.
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, they've just done small things and big things. So the leaders in my study just began to talk to their team about, I've been through this, or this is something I've experienced, or this is how it's been for me, and I wonder if you've had any experiences like this. And so just very small things like that, to then holding days. I mean, some of the big companies in London, you started having these days called sort of, I can't remember what they're called, but like, come and tell your story. And the leaders would stand up and they would tell some of their experience of having a mental health condition or having a mental health struggle, and inviting people, if they wanted to come and tell this story. And the phone company 3 had one of these days, and they just found that there were just so many people who wanted to come and tell the story. They sort of extended this initiative over a week. And it's just like, we're all normal. This isn't a thing that weird people who can't function have. Like we all have mental health, and then we have it to different strengths at different times. And so I think that's one of the things. And some people have gone very public, and some of the sort of celebrities and people talk in a different way and talk to the media, and that's helpful too. But I think it's just about saying, this is just how it is. Mm-hmm. And it's not even a big confession. It's just, this is what's been going on for me, and making sure that if other people want to talk, they can also come forward with it.
Absolutely. And what I love about all of your responses so far is that we are starting to also call attention and critique our field as well. Our field being the broader field of management, but also even within POS. There is room for us to discuss hardship in trying to build out positive scholarship, right? And I think for a long time I had a naive view that, and even we still say it today, oh, this is not POSC enough. It's like, no, it is, right? It all is, because life is POS, right? We are looking to optimize the human experience, and that includes including our hardships and including the things that are grief-stricken and suffering. Jen, did you raise your hand? Oh. I think we have a question here. Yeah.
Sally, I have an association to Wilfred Bien's work, right? That he would get the soldiers who had shell-shocked, and he developed all these techniques, but he was essentially sending them back to be killed. And I'm kind of hopeful about your research, but it's super disturbing that they go back and they're strengthened and they can recognize it in others. But what are they doing about the toxicity of the workplace? Like, do they realize that the issue is the toxic culture of overwork? And are they doing anything about that? Or are they just saying, I've had this hard problem, you might have it, and I'm going to try and support you, but I'm actually not going to do anything about the root cause of the issue?
So some are and some aren't. It's probably the sort of simple answer to that. And even just trying to change like what's acceptable in work, that it's acceptable that you should be going out at lunchtime and you should be having a walk in the in nature, and you should be having meetings while you walk, and that people can take days off. I mean, one of the firms of the guys I talked to just has imposed mental health days. Like, they're just closing the office globally on a certain day, just so that everybody is forced to take a holiday. And that's not necessarily the direct result of one of my leaders, but it's part of it being infused more in the culture. So everybody's still working, and probably working too much, but I think you can really change what it's like to be at work and to have colleagues and to be even expectations of people. So, yes and no. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for engaging with us today. I'd love for us to thank our panel too for their wonderful comments. And I'd like to make a brief announcement for all of those who have poster presentations. I'd ask you to stand up and go stand next to your poster before the rest of us come herd you over there. So that way you're not nervous. You can go set up and get ready, and we'll give them some time to get there. I also want us to make sure we do go look at the posters after they've had a chance to sort of set up. It is on the 6th floor, so we'll give them some time to get up there and not feel that they have to rush. Okay. And I encourage you all, as you're going back to your respective homes today, that you think about how you can create more relevance with your work. What does it look like to build capacity in our scholarship and in our practice and our POS lens? So thank you again to our panel.